The snow came early that winter. By mid-December 1944, the Ardennes lay buried under a suffocating white silence. Deep forests heavy with ice, winding roads slick with frozen mud. To the men of the U.S. Army scattered along the line, it felt like the war was finally slowing down. The Germans, they thought, were beaten. Supplies were short, morale was tired, but Christmas was near, and the line in Belgium was quiet. Too quiet, as some would later say. No one expected that within days, the last great German offensive of the war would explode from those frozen woods like a sudden, desperate scream from a dying army. The Battle of the Bulge began before dawn, on December 16, 1944. Artillery fire shattered the silence across the Ardennes. Shells rained down on American positions as Wehrmacht and SS divisions surged through the fog, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. The German plan was audacious: split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and force a political collapse. In those first chaotic hours, it almost worked. American lines broke. Entire units were cut off or swallowed by the advance. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was surrounded. In St. Vith and Elsenborn, American engineers and infantry held on by inches, buying time with blood. But hidden behind that chaos, unknown to the Germans, was a quiet revolution of American engineering that would soon turn the tide. A weapon that, for months, had been kept secret even from many of the soldiers who used it. It wasn't a tank or a plane or some exotic supergun. It was a fuse, a small, seemingly unremarkable piece of metal and circuitry that would become one of the deadliest innovations of the war. The proximity fuse. For years, Allied scientists had worked in secrecy to develop it. In laboratories scattered across the United States and Britain, physicists and engineers struggled with a question that sounded almost impossible: how to make a shell explode when it was merely near its target, without a direct hit. It required miniaturized radar, vacuum tubes that could survive tens of thousands of Gs of acceleration, and circuitry that could trigger in microseconds. It was science fiction for the 1940s, but by late 1943, it had become reality. The first VT, or variable time, fuses began to appear in naval anti-aircraft shells. Suddenly, instead of bursting harmlessly behind enemy aircraft, shells could now detonate when they passed close by, shredding wings and fuselages with deadly precision. The Japanese and Germans never saw it coming. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had begun to issue proximity-fused shells for field artillery. But there was a catch. These fuses were top secret, so secret that even captured fragments could reveal too much to the enemy. Eisenhower himself forbade their use over land, where unexploded rounds might be recovered. Until December. Until the Bulge. The first days of the battle were a nightmare for the Allies. The weather, low clouds, snow, and freezing rain, grounded Allied aircraft. Without air cover, German armor columns roared through the fog, catching American units off guard. The Luftwaffe, long thought crippled, suddenly reappeared in the skies. German artillery, skillfully masked by the trees, pounded crossroads and command posts. American batteries answered, but their shells fell blind into the woods, killing few. It was during those dark days, as German infantry advanced through the thick forests around Bastogne and Saint-Vith, that General Omar Bradley made the call. Permission was granted. The proximity fuse would be used over land. The secret weapon was unleashed. The first reports came in from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions near the Elsenborn Ridge. American gunners loaded their 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers with the new shells, indistinguishable from ordinary rounds except for the faint, mysterious code stamped on their bases. The Germans were moving through the woods in tight columns, confident in their cover. Snow muffled their boots. The men kept close, barely visible through the mist. Then the first barrage came. The shells exploded, not in the trees, not in the ground, but in the air. Bursts of steel and fire ripped through the forest canopy, raining shrapnel on everything below. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to ducking beneath the snow-covered pines suddenly found death descending from above. The old tricks of survival, digging in, crawling under logs, no longer worked. Every place was vulnerable. Survivors recalled the horror of it. They said it was as if the sky itself had turned against them. Machine gun fire could be avoided. Mortars could be outrun. But the proximity-fused shells struck invisibly, detonating at just the right distance, tearing through flesh and bark alike. In minutes, entire platoons vanished in the snow. On the American side, artillerymen watched the effect with grim astonishment. Battery commanders reported kill zones so dense that even seasoned gunners went quiet after the firing ceased. The fuse had transformed their guns into something closer to anti-personnel scythes. The Germans, who had counted on surprise and movement, now found themselves pinned in place. For every yard gained, they paid a price in blood. At Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne held the line against encirclement, proximity-fused shells became a lifeline. The Germans launched repeated attacks from the surrounding woods, probing for weakness. American gunners fired pre-registered barrages into the trees, detonating shells just above the attackers. The effect was devastating. One observer wrote that it looked like fireworks in daylight, except each burst meant death. In the frozen silence that followed each salvo, only the crackle of burning pines and the cries of the wounded remained. By Christmas, the German advance had begun to slow. The skies cleared, allowing Allied air power to return. But on the ground, it was the artillery, the unsung, invisible arm of the army, that did much of the killing. The proximity fuse, in the words of General George S. Patton, won the Battle of the Bulge for us. Historians would later debate that claim. Some argued that logistics, weather, and sheer German exhaustion played larger roles. But there is no doubt that the fuse changed the tempo of the battle. It stripped the Wehrmacht of one of its oldest advantages, the ability to move unseen under cover of terrain. No longer could infantry creep close under fog or forest. Every cluster of movement drew death from above. Behind the lines, word of the weapons spread in whispers. Soldiers called it the magic fuse. To them, it felt almost supernatural. Yet, for the scientists who built it, men like Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, it was the product of relentless experiment and failure. Thousands of test shells had shattered on proving grounds before one finally worked. Each successful shot was the result of years of invisible struggle hidden behind the front lines. The Germans never fully understood what had hit them. Intelligence reports from captured prisoners described confusion and fear. They spoke of shells that followed them, of invisible spotters, of new American radar systems that could sense movement. They never suspected that the technology was inside the shell itself. And by the time they realized the pattern, it was too late. As the Bulge collapsed in January 1945, American forces pushed the Germans back across the Rhine. The snow melted into a brown sea of mud and ruin. Burnt-out Panthers and half-tracks lay half-buried by the thaw. In the forests of the Ardennes, the evidence of those terrible barrages remained. Trees stripped of branches by airbursts, their trunks shredded by shrapnel. In some places, the bark had fused with metal fragments, frozen in place like scars. The proximity fuse would go on to shape the final months of the war. It was used in the Rhine crossings, in the bombardments of the Siegfried Line, and later across the Pacific, where it became a decisive tool against kamikaze attacks. But nowhere did it change the battlefield so suddenly, so completely, as it did in those frozen Belgian woods. The men who served there seldom forgot it. Artillerymen spoke of that winter with a mixture of pride and unease. They knew they had wielded something new, something that blurred the line between precision and annihilation. For the Germans who survived, it marked a turning point. One officer later wrote that by January, morale had collapsed not from hunger or cold, but from a feeling that the Americans could strike us anywhere, even through the air itself. When the war ended, the secret of the fuse finally emerged. Scientists who had worked in isolation learned how their invention had saved lives on the front. Military leaders called it one of the three great technological triumphs of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike the bomb, the proximity fuse carried no headlines, no blinding flash, only the quiet precision of unseen death. Its creation had demanded an unlikely alliance. British theorists, American engineers, and thousands of factory workers who never knew what they were building. Women assembled miniature vacuum tubes under microscopes, unaware that their work would change the course of battles continents away. Every fuse had to survive immense acceleration, extreme cold, and vibration, yet still function flawlessly when it counted. Failure meant a dead soldier, or worse, a lost position. The secrecy surrounding the project was so intense that even many generals didn't know its full scope. It was designated a classified war device, guarded by the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Only a handful of senior commanders could authorize its field use. When the first shipment reached Europe, it was escorted by military police, under orders to destroy the shells rather than let them fall into enemy hands. And yet, when the Bulge erupted, all those precautions gave way to necessity. The Allies were reeling, and Eisenhower knew that extraordinary measures were needed. That decision, to use the fuse, reflected a broader truth of war. Innovation born not from confidence, but from desperation. As the front stabilized in early January, American artillery dominated the battlefield. The sound of their guns echoed across valleys, hour after hour. The Germans had no answer. Their counter-battery fire grew weaker each day as ammunition dwindled. The last great gamble of the Reich was unraveling. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied front died somewhere amid those snow-covered ridges, buried under the fire of thousands of proximity-fused shells. In the aftermath, soldiers walked through fields littered with the dead. They spoke little. The snow had turned gray with soot and blood. In places, it was impossible to tell man from earth, uniform from frozen mud. The efficiency of it all, the precision, the cold perfection, left some uneasy. War had always been brutal, but this was different. The fuse had turned distance into lethality, safety into illusion. For historians, the story of the proximity fuse is one of the quiet revolutions of modern warfare. It marked the moment when technology began to close the gap between human perception and machine precision. Artillery no longer needed to guess. It knew when to kill. Yet even among those who celebrated it, there was an unspoken question. What would come next? If a fuse could think, even in the most primitive way, could a weapon ever again be entirely under human control? That question, born in the Ardennes, would echo into the Cold War and beyond. The men who fought there didn't ponder such things in the moment. They were too cold, too exhausted, too busy surviving. But in their letters home, a few hinted at the feeling that something had changed. "The shells," one artillery sergeant wrote, "are smarter than we are. They find the enemy on their own." When spring finally came to Europe in 1945, the forests bloomed again. The scars of battle softened beneath new leaves. But for those who had seen it, the blinding flashes, the air itself erupting, the memory never faded. The Battle of the Bulge had been the last great test of the American army in Europe, and it had revealed not only courage, but ingenuity. In that desperate winter, the Allies had matched German fury not with greater numbers, but with greater understanding of physics, of engineering, of what war demanded in the age of machines. And somewhere in that frozen forest, amid the broken trees and silent craters, lay the proof. Tiny shards of circuitry and glass, half buried in the snow. The remnants of the device that had changed the battle. A weapon small enough to hold in one hand, yet powerful enough to alter history. Long after the war ended, when veterans gathered and spoke of that winter, they didn't speak of the fuse as a marvel. They spoke of what it meant. That even in the darkest hour, when everything seemed lost, human minds had found a way to fight back. Quietly, invisibly, with precision born of desperation. The Germans had called their offensive Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. But by its end, it was the Americans who held the watch, their guns silent now, their secrets spent. The snow melted, the fog lifted, and the war moved on. Yet in that fleeting moment, the balance of power had shifted, not by brute force, but by a few inches of metal and glass, spinning through the air, sensing, calculating, and exploding at the perfect moment. It was not the roar of engines or the cry of men that defined the Battle of the Bulge. It was the whisper of science in the midst of chaos, the hum of innovation, buried in a shell casing, waiting to be fired. When the guns fell silent in January 1945, the Ardennes looked like another planet. The snow was blackened with soot. The trees split open as if struck by lightning. Smoke still drifted above the ridgelines, mingling with the faint scent of cordite and pine. The German offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, had failed. But beneath the frozen ground lay the traces of something that would echo far beyond those woods, the dawn of a new kind of warfare. As the Allies pushed east, the proximity fuse moved with them. By February, American divisions along the Rhine were equipped almost entirely with VT-fused shells. They had learned to trust the weapon, to measure its effect by silence. When a barrage ended and no counterattack came, they knew the shells had found their mark. In reports compiled after the campaign, officers wrote of unprecedented lethality, of German units annihilated before they could even deploy. The fuse had erased the margin between contact and destruction. The Germans, for their part, could only guess at what had changed. Their field intelligence units reported strange new artillery effects, bursts at tree height, explosions that shredded entire patrols without visible impact craters. Rumors spread among the infantry. The Americans had found a way to track men through the snow. Their guns could see through the fog. Some claimed Allied spotter planes carried invisible radar beams that triggered shells midair. The truth, that each shell carried its own miniature radar set, was beyond imagination. Even in Berlin, the mystery unsettled the high command. Technical officers tried to analyze captured fragments, but the circuitry was too small, too alien to German production methods. One Luftwaffe engineer, after examining a recovered component, declared it as impossible to mass-produce as a wristwatch that commands a battleship. He wasn't far off. The Allies had already produced more than 20 million such fuses, each a masterpiece of precision manufacturing, born from an industrial scale the Reich could no longer match. In the weeks that followed, the impact rippled through the Allied ranks. Artillery was no longer just support. It was dominance. Infantry advances were choreographed around timed airbursts, every movement shielded by invisible walls of shrapnel. Commanders began to speak of the battlefield in terms of zones of certainty, areas where the enemy could not survive. The proximity fuse had made those zones real. For many soldiers, this technological edge carried a strange weight. Some found comfort in its efficiency. Others felt haunted by it. Letters from the front reveal a quiet unease among gunners. "It doesn't feel like fighting," one corporal wrote. "It's like pulling a lever, and the sky does the rest." The fuse had mechanized death to a degree that left little room for valor. You didn't see the men you killed. You didn't even see the explosion. It happened far away, high above the trees. All you heard was the echo. Yet for the commanders, there was no ambiguity. The fuse had saved lives, American lives. Every German platoon broken by airburst meant fewer Allied casualties in the counteroffensive. Eisenhower himself later wrote that the proximity fuse was one of the most important new developments in the war, and that without it, the Battle of the Bulge might have cost us twice as dearly. Behind that triumph lay a secret world few soldiers ever saw. In underground factories across the United States, the weapons production continued around the clock. At the Crosley Corporation in Ohio, women assembled tiny vacuum tubes under magnifiers, their hands steady from repetition. They knew only that it was for the war. Each fuse was tested by vibration, heat, and acceleration before being packed in wax-sealed crates marked Fuse VT non-fragmenting. Every detail mattered. The wrong solder joint could mean failure in flight. In England, at Woolwich Arsenal and Waltham Abbey, technicians trained to install the fuses by hand. They wore gloves to avoid static discharge, speaking little, as if the silence preserved the secret. When shipments left for the continent, they were escorted by military police armed with burn orders. No shell was to fall into enemy hands intact. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the proximity fuse reached its full potential. The Germans had dug in along the Siegfried Line, their defenses thick with concrete and barbed wire. For years, these fortifications had been thought nearly impenetrable. But when the barrage began, the very air above those bunkers turned lethal. Airbursts swept through trenches and gun emplacements, leaving defenders dazed or dead before the infantry even advanced. The line that Hitler had once called impregnable dissolved in a matter of days. German officers were stunned. Reports described unbearable shelling, instant suppression, no safe ground. The morale that had already crumbled in the Ardennes now collapsed entirely. For the Wehrmacht, the war had become unwinnable not just in men or machines, but in understanding. The Allies had entered an age of warfare the Germans could no longer follow. When the war in Europe ended that May, the proximity fuse was still classified. Even as the atomic bomb dominated headlines, the fuse remained a guarded secret. Only in 1946 did the public begin to learn what had happened, that a miniature radar had turned ordinary shells into thinking weapons. The scientists behind it, Tuve, Hofstad, and the team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, emerged from anonymity to cautious applause. Few outside their circles grasped the scale of what they'd achieved. In hindsight, the fuse's legacy is double-edged. It represented a triumph of ingenuity, the union of science and necessity. But it also marked a shift in how war would be fought. The proximity fuse was the first step toward automation, the moment when weapons began to decide for themselves when to kill. From that lineage would come radar-guided missiles, heat-seeking bombs, and eventually smart munitions capable of independent targeting. The line that began in the snow of the Ardennes runs straight to the skies over modern battlefields, yet none of that was known to the men who fought there. For them, the fuse was just another tool of survival. They remembered its sound, the high, distant whistle of shells cutting through frozen air, the sudden thunder above the treetops, and then silence. To the infantry crouched in foxholes, it was salvation. To those caught beneath it, damnation. In the years after the war, veterans returning to Belgium sometimes visited the forests where they had fought. Many found fragments of the old shells still embedded in trees, rusted and half-buried under moss. Children would pick them up without knowing what they were. Souvenirs of a past that had once burned through those same woods. For the men who remembered, each shard was a reminder of the strange power that had saved them, and the price of wielding it. Among historians, the proximity fuse remains one of the least visible yet most decisive weapons of World War II. It didn't roar like a tank or gleam like a Mustang in the sun. It was unseen, unheard, until the instant it struck. Its victory was measured not in miles gained, but in formations erased. And so, when we speak of the Battle of the Bulge, we often recall Bastogne, or the frozen foxholes, or Patton's drive north through the snow. But behind every one of those moments was the thunder of American guns. And behind those guns, the quiet genius of a few minds who gave their soldiers a weapon the enemy could not comprehend. That winter, amid fog and blood and frozen trees, the Germans learned a brutal truth. The sky itself could now kill. Not by luck, not by guesswork, but by design. The air bursts that tore their formations apart were not miracles of aim, but mathematics in motion. When the snow finally melted and the rivers ran free again, the secret of the proximity fuse remained buried in the mud, scattered among the forests of the Ardennes, tiny circuits of glass and wire, silent witnesses to the moment when science turned the tide of war. And in that silence, history shifted. The old world of courage and chance gave way to one of precision and inevitability. From that moment onward, no army would march beneath the open sky without remembering what had happened there, when the air itself began to think. If you've stayed to the end, you're one of the few who still wants the truth. Subscribe, and together, we'll uncover every secret the Second World War tried to keep buried.